Let's set the stage. Medieval Middle East. Deserts, fortresses, crusader castles sitting awkwardly on sun-bleached hills, empires rising and collapsing like waves. It's a world full of political backstabbing, ambitious warlords, religious zeal, and shifting alliances that would make even today's geopolitics look simple. And in the middle of all this chaos, steps one man. A man whose very name still sparks debates, admiration, and a kind of awe that crosses cultures, religions, and even centuries. Saladin Ayyubi, popularly known as Saladin. Now, what's wild is that Saladin isn't one of those figures who's only respected by one side of history. Muslims admire him, many Christians admire him, historians admire him, novelists, poets, filmmakers, even people who barely know anything about the Crusades somehow know the name Saladin. He's become this symbol of chivalry, justice, mercy, and strategic brilliance. And in a world where historical figures often get messier the more you look at them, Saladin is one of the rare ones who actually becomes more impressive the deeper you go. But here's the thing, Saladin didn't come from a legendary bloodline. He wasn't born a prince. He wasn't destined for greatness in some prophecy. In fact, if you were there when he was a kid, you probably wouldn't even pick him out of a lineup. He was quiet, introverted, more interested in learning than fighting. And absolutely no one thought he'd grow up to become the man who would unite a fractured Muslim world and take back Jerusalem. That's the magic of his story, and honestly, that's what makes him worth revisiting today. Because Saladin isn't just about battles and strategy. He's about leadership without ego, strength without cruelty, and a version of power that isn't rooted in fear but in respect. His life reads like a legend, but it's all real. The victories, the struggles, the heartbreaks, the impossible decisions, all of it. In 1137, in the town of Tikrit, a modest settlement on the Tigris River, Saladin was born into a Kurdish family that wasn't wealthy but certainly wasn't powerless either. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, and his uncle Shirkuh were military men, respected, skilled, but nowhere near the level of fame their family would one day achieve. The Ayyubid family didn't stay long in Tikrit. In fact, Saladin's father had to leave the same night Saladin was born. The family was banished after a political incident. Their destination? Mosul and eventually Damascus, the city that would shape Saladin more than any other place in his early life. In the 12th century, Damascus was a buzzing cultural hub. Scholars, poets, merchants, everyone passed through the Damascus. Saladin grew up in that environment, surrounded by soldiers and scholars. He wasn't a prodigy with a wooden sword or some mini-general planning pretend battles in the courtyard. He was quiet, thoughtful, almost shy. He loved books more than weapons, religious studies, philosophy, poetry. These were the things that interested him. His tutors described him as someone who absorbed knowledge like a sponge. His mind never seemed to rest. And maybe that's what makes his later military genius so surprising. He wasn't raised to be a conqueror. He was raised to be a thinker. His father and uncle were deeply involved in the politics of the region, especially under the rule of Zengi, the ambitious leader trying to unify Muslim territories against the Crusader states. Through his family's connections, young Saladin grew up around warriors and political strategists. He saw firsthand how fragile alliances were, how quickly loyalties shifted, how power worked at the highest levels. So from a young age, he's learning two parallel worlds, the world of scholarship and the world of military power. And eventually those two worlds would merge inside him in a way that changed history. As much as Saladin loved learning, the world around him wasn't going to let him stay in a library forever, especially not with a family like his. By the time Saladin was in his teens, his father and uncle had firmly planted him in the orbit of military life. He started learning the basics: horse riding, archery, swordsmanship, and the subtle art of reading an opponent's move before they even made it. His early years in military training were more like an apprenticeship in observation than a crash course in combat. He watched seasoned commanders, studied their tactics, memorized their moves, and internalized strategies that many soldiers would only understand after decades of war. While other boys dreamed of glory, Saladin was quietly learning patience, the kind of patience that would later let him outmaneuver entire armies. He was also trained in leadership, His mentors weren't just showing him how to swing a sword, they were teaching him how to inspire men, how to balance loyalty with discipline, and how to make impossible decisions under pressure. And trust me, that's not something every young warrior gets to learn before stepping onto a battlefield. Another crucial aspect of his early development was religion and ethics. Saladin grew up in a deeply spiritual household. He wasn't just learning the mechanics of war, he was also learning the principles of justice, mercy, and honor. These lessons would stick with him in ways that shocked both allies and enemies later on. Unlike many rulers of his time, Saladin believed that strength didn't have to mean cruelty. There's a story that illustrates this part of his character. As a young man, Saladin was once offered the chance to strike down a captured enemy. Everyone expected him to act like a typical warrior, but instead he spared the man's life, insisting that mercy was stronger than vengeance. Little moments like this weren't just moral choices, they were early lessons in leadership that would define his later campaigns. The real test of his training came when he finally stepped onto the battlefield. His first experiences weren't grand, world-changing battles. They were small skirmishes under the command of his uncle, Shirkuh, in Egypt and Syria. But these skirmishes were the perfect testing ground. He got to apply strategy, experiment with tactics, and, most importantly, see how a disciplined mind could outthink brute force. By the time Saladin was in his early 20s, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a thinker in armor. His early reluctance had transformed into a quiet confidence. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. And when he made a move on the battlefield, it wasn't just strong. It was smart. So here's the takeaway. Saladin's early training didn't just make him a warrior, it made him a leader who could unite, strategize, and inspire. And that combination of brains, patience, and ethical conviction, it's what made the world sit up and take notice when he finally stepped into history's spotlight. The next big step in Saladin's story comes through a man who was both a mentor and a testing ground, Nur ad-Din Zangi. Nur ad-Din was a powerhouse in the Muslim world at the time. Ambitious, ruthless when needed, but also remarkably strategic. He had one goal: to unite the Muslim territories and push back against the Crusader states. And this is where Saladin enters the bigger political and military stage. He was sent under Nur ad-Din's banner alongside his uncle Shirkuh on campaigns that would test his skill, patience, and moral compass. Now, serving under Nur ad-Din wasn't easy. This was a man who didn't tolerate failure, and the stakes were always high. One misstep could mean death, dishonor, or complete political ruin. But for Saladin, this was the perfect crucible. He was young enough to learn, smart enough to adapt, and disciplined enough to survive. His early assignments were in Egypt, a land in turmoil at the time. Egypt was nominally under Fatimid rule but practically falling apart due to weak leadership, internal corruption, and external threats. Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh, with Saladin tagging along, to intervene. The idea was simple: secure Egypt for the broader Muslim cause and strengthen the front against the Crusaders. Simple in theory, chaotic in practice. Saladin wasn't the top commander yet, but his intelligence and temperament started standing out. He had a way of seeing the bigger picture, of understanding the political chessboard in addition to the battlefield. While Shirkuh fought battles and negotiated deals, Saladin was quietly studying alliances, observing enemies, and noting how loyalty and fear shaped armies. And then came a pivotal moment. Shirkuh dies unexpectedly in 1169. Suddenly, Saladin is thrust into a position of real authority in Egypt. He's not just the apprentice anymore. He's the man in charge. At this time, he was in his early 30s. Imagine being that young, in a foreign land, leading a fractured army and trying to stabilize a politically unstable country, all while keeping an eye on both the Crusaders and his nominal overlord Nur ad-Din. Saladin rises to the challenge spectacularly. He consolidates power without unnecessary bloodshed, wins the loyalty of local elites, and strengthens the army. He balances diplomacy and force, understanding that ruling a country isn't just about winning battles, it's about winning hearts and minds. His style is pragmatic, measured, and unusually humane for the time. People who might have opposed him often ended up respecting or even supporting him. Another crucial part of his rise is his relationship with Nur ad-Din. While he is loyal, Saladin starts making subtle moves that indicate independence. He knows how to take initiative without overstepping, a skill that will serve him brilliantly later. He learns that leadership isn't about blind obedience, it's about judgment, timing, and knowing when to act decisively. By the end of this period, Saladin had transformed from a cautious, reluctant warrior into a proven commander and statesman. He's learned how to navigate political intrigue, command armies, and wield authority with wisdom. Most importantly, he's begun to understand his own potential, that he's capable of uniting not just armies, but entire regions under a common cause. The young scholar turned apprentice warrior has now become the leader of Egypt, a strategic hub that will serve as the launching pad for everything that comes next, including the creation of a dynasty that will carry his name across centuries. By 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which had been in steady decline for decades, was teetering on the brink. The state was fragmented, the leadership was weak, and there were of external powers such as crusaders, rival Muslim factions, or internal rebels taking advantage. Saladin saw both a challenge and an opportunity. Saladin didn't just march in with an army like a typical conqueror. He understood the symbolic and political weight of legitimacy. So instead of declaring himself king, he abolishes the Fatimid Caliphate, pledges allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and positions himself as the protector and unifier of Sunni Islam in Egypt. And just like that, he's no longer a subordinate commander. He's the de facto ruler of Egypt, but with a clever political strategy. He gained power while appearing loyal to the greater religious authority. This move gave him legitimacy that many other rulers of the time could only dream of. And that's how the Ayyubid dynasty was formed. Named after his father, Ayyub, Saladin establishes a ruling family that will last for generations. But more than just a family name, the Ayyubid dynasty represents a new approach to leadership: strategic, principled, and in many ways, inclusive. Saladin surrounds himself with capable men, not just loyal family, and he rewards merit, which keeps the administration strong and motivated. But let's not sugarcoat it. Consolidating Egypt wasn't easy. He had to deal with Fatimid loyalists who weren't thrilled about the transition, rival military commanders, and a population that had seen decades of chaos. Saladin's genius here was patience and pragmatism. Instead of crushing dissent with brute force, he built alliances, incorporates former rivals into his administration, and balances firmness with generosity. By the late 1170s, Saladin wasn't just a ruler. He became a regional power broker. Egypt became a strong, centralized state under his command, a foundation that allows him to pursue a bigger dream, uniting the Muslim world against the Crusaders. This is the moment when Saladin's personal story intersects with history in a monumental way. Up until now, he's been climbing, learning, surviving. But now he's at the helm, making decisions that will shape the future of the Middle East. And this is where we start seeing the full scope of his ambition, not the ambition of a conqueror seeking personal glory, but of a leader envisioning a unified, stronger Muslim world. Now that Saladin is firmly in charge of Egypt and has established the Ayyubid dynasty, he faces a problem that is both obvious and enormous. The Muslim world is utterly fragmented: Syria, Mesopotamia, Yemen. All these regions have different rulers, different agendas, and a history of rivalry. And let's not forget the looming crusader states along the coast, acting like thorny reminders that unity is urgently needed. Here's the thing: Saladin wasn't the kind of leader who ruled through fear. He ruled through respect, strategic alliances, and carefully measured diplomacy. He understood that no single force could conquer the Crusaders alone, especially with constant infighting between Muslim rulers. So he set out to create alliances that were as much about loyalty as they were about pragmatism. His first target? Syria, the land of his old mentor, Nur ad-Din. By this point, Nur ad-Din had passed away, leaving a power vacuum. Many expected chaos, and many tried to take advantage, but Saladin moved carefully. He He didn't rush in to seize power aggressively. Instead, he positioned himself as a stabilizing force. He built alliances with local leaders, offered protection, and subtly expanded his influence without making outright enemies. Here's a key piece of his genius. Saladin combined diplomacy with military presence. He'd negotiate, send envoys, and even marry strategically to strengthen ties, all while maintaining a capable army ready to act if diplomacy failed. And it wasn't just about geography. Saladin also understood the importance of reputation. He cultivated an image of fairness and justice. He treated allies with respect and enemies with a level of honor that was rare in the 12th century. This wasn't sentimental. It was strategic. Leaders were more willing to work with him, and soldiers were willing to fight for him because they knew he would reward loyalty and act justly. Of course, not everyone bowed willingly. There were rebellions, challenges from ambitious local emirs, and opportunistic generals trying to carve out their own fiefdoms. But Saladin's approach was consistent: neutralize threats through negotiation first, confrontation second. Often, former rivals ended up becoming loyal commanders or governors under his administration. By the early 1180s, Saladin had effectively united a vast stretch of territory under his leadership: Egypt, Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, and even influence reaching into Yemen. This unity was unprecedented, at least in recent memory, and it gave him the resources, manpower, and legitimacy to take on the Crusader states head-on. But there's another side to this story. While we talk about diplomacy and strategy, Saladin also had to balance personal ethics with political reality. He believed in mercy and justice, yet he had to be ruthless when necessary. Every decision was a careful calculation: how much force to use, when to negotiate, and when to strike, all while keeping his larger goal in sight. This combination of strategic foresight, political skill, and ethical grounding is what makes Saladin stand out among medieval leaders. Most rulers might have relied on brute force, intimidation, or sheer luck. Saladin relied on vision, patience, and the ability to read both men and situations. And this groundwork sets the stage for what comes next: the legendary campaigns against the Crusaders, the battles that would define his place in history, and the moment the world would truly take notice of his genius. In summer of 1187, the Crusader states in the Levant, Jerusalem, Acre, Tyre, and others, started feeling uneasy. Saladin had spent years uniting Muslim territories, strengthening armies, and carefully building a reputation that makes leaders and soldiers alike rally to his cause. But Jerusalem, the jewel in the Crusader crown, remained a thorn in his side, both politically and spiritually. Retaking it wouldn't just be a military objective, it was to be a symbolic goal that would resonate across the Muslim world. The Crusaders, meanwhile, weren't sitting idle. They were politically fractured, overconfident, and divided among themselves. Some commanders underestimated Saladin. Some dismissed him entirely as a threat. This is exactly the opening he needed. What made Saladin's approach at Hattin so brilliant is that it wasn't about brute force alone. He didn't rush into any head-on confrontation with the Crusader army and hope for the best. Instead, he carefully manipulated the battlefield and the enemy's resources. He controlled water supplies, used the desert terrain to his advantage, and forced the Crusaders into a position where they were exhausted, thirsty, and disorganized before the actual battle even began. He won part of the battle without a single sword striking yet. He understood logistics, timing, and psychology. And he used all three to turn a numerical stalemate into a decisive advantage. When the armies finally clashed near the horns of Hattin, Saladin's forces were in perfect position. The Crusaders were tired, their knights disorganized, and their morale low. Saladin's cavalry and archers struck with precision. He used the terrain to channel the enemy into traps. And when the decisive moment came, he didn't just rely on brute strength. He exploited every weakness in the Crusader formation. The result, a stunning and almost complete victory. The Crusader army was destroyed, their leaders captured, and their confidence shattered. Saladin's patience, strategy, and ability to see the bigger picture had turned a battle that could have gone either way into a crushing success. But here's the part that cements Saladin's legend. even in victory, he chose mercy when it mattered. He treated prisoners with respect, spared lives, and avoided unnecessary slaughter, actions that earned him admiration even from his defeated enemies. It's one thing to win a battle. It's another to win respect on a battlefield strewn with corpses. Saladin did both. The victory at Hattin wasn't just a military achievement. It's a turning point in the Crusades, the moment when the balance of power shifts decisively in favor of the Muslim world and sets the stage for what everyone had been anticipating: the March on Jerusalem, the city that had eluded Muslim forces for nearly a century. Now we've reached one of the most iconic moments in Saladin's life: the capture of Jerusalem in 1187. If the Battle of Hattin was his masterstroke on the battlefield, this would be his masterpiece in combining strategy, diplomacy, and character. After the Crusaders' devastating loss at Hattin, the path to Jerusalem was mostly open. But here's the thing: Jerusalem wasn't just another city. It was the city, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. Taking it was both a military challenge and a moral, political, and spiritual dilemma. Saladin knew the world was watching, not just the armies around him, but the hearts and minds of people from across the world. Now, imagine the tension. The city's defenders are desperate, knowing their forces are depleted after Hattin. The inhabitants were terrified. Pilgrims, priests, and ordinary civilians were caught in the middle. And here came Saladin, a conquering army at the gates, but a man who had built a reputation for mercy. Saladin did something remarkable. He negotiated the surrender of Jerusalem instead of launching a bloody assault. He offered terms that allowed civilians to leave safely in exchange for a ransom, spared the holy sites, and avoided massacres that had tragically marked some earlier Crusader conquests. In other words, he captured Jerusalem without turning it into a bloodbath. This was strategy and principle intertwined. By showing mercy, Saladin consolidated his legitimacy, strengthened his moral authority, and earned respect, even from his enemies. The act sent a message to the entire region. This wasn't conquest for the sake of vengeance. This was leadership guided by principle. There's a symbolic brilliance to this as well. Jerusalem wasn't just a strategic location, it was a psychological prize. By taking it decisively, Saladin demonstrated that unity, patience, and ethical leadership can achieve what brute force alone cannot. The Crusader states were shaken, morale plummeted, and Saladin's legend grew, not just as a warrior, but as a wise and just ruler. And it's here that we start seeing the dual nature of his legacy: a military genius and a moral exemplar. While he was feared on the battlefield, he was also admired for fairness and humanity, a combination that's rare in history. By the time he left Jerusalem, he was not only a conqueror, he was a figure whose reputation transcended borders, faiths, and generations. People don't just remember the victory, they remember how it was achieved. Now we move into one of the most storied chapters of the Crusades: Saladin versus Richard the Lionheart. This period cemented Saladin's legend in the eyes of the world, not just as a conqueror, but as a rival worthy of respect from one of Europe's most famous kings. Richard I of England, the Lionheart himself, arrived in the Holy Land in 1189, determined to reclaim Jerusalem for the Crusaders. He was bold, aggressive, and as fierce as his reputation suggested. But here's what made this clash fascinating. These two men, at the peak of their power, never met face-to-face in battle. Instead, they engaged in a war of strategy, psychology, and reputation, punctuated by a few skirmishes and sieges. One of the first things people notice about this rivalry is the mutual respect. Both men are brilliant strategists and bold warriors, and both recognize those qualities in the other. They exchanged messages, letters, and even gifts, balancing hostility with an almost chivalric courtesy. Unlike many wars of the time, personal cruelty was rare between them, and that elevated the conflict from mere bloodshed to something almost epic. Take, for example, the Siege of Acre, one of the longest and bloodiest engagements of the Crusades. Richard's forces were relentless, Saladin's forces held strong, and civilians were caught in the middle. Yet even in the heat of this brutal confrontation, Saladin maintained his reputation for fair treatment of prisoners and respect for non-combatants. When Richard captured Muslim soldiers, Saladin reciprocated in kind. This back and forth of honor and strategy becomes legendary. There are also countless stories about personal gestures of respect. Richard reportedly admired Saladin's generosity, patience, and tactical brilliance, while Saladin recognized Richard's courage and steadfastness. It's rare in history to see two leaders so deeply at odds, yet bound by mutual admiration. Strategically, Saladin used timing, terrain, and patience against Richard's bold assaults. He didn't rush headlong into pitched battles unless the conditions were favorable. He was cautious but decisive, always thinking several moves ahead, and even when he faced setbacks, he adapted, consolidated, and struck again, wearing down the Crusader states over time. This period also underscores Saladin's long-term vision. He wasn't just fighting battles, he was shaping a sustainable strategy for unifying the Muslim world and protecting Jerusalem. Richard may have captured some territory, but Saladin ensured that the Crusader states are never strong enough to retake Jerusalem during his lifetime. In short, the encounters with Richard the Lionheart are as much about brains as brawn. Two brilliant leaders, each commanding armies, each representing distinct cultures and religions, both capable of extraordinary violence, yet both bound by codes of honor that elevate their story to legendary status. By the time Saladin was in his 50s, he had already become a living legend. The man who took Jerusalem, defeated armies at Hattin, and held his own against Richard the Lionheart. But history wasn't about to let him rest. The Crusader states were still there, stubbornly clinging to coastal cities like Tyre, Acre, and Antioch. And Saladin knew that victory wasn't just about conquering, it was about maintaining control and protecting the lands he'd fought so hard to unify. These final campaigns were fascinating because they showed a different side of Saladin. He's no longer the young commander learning the ropes or the ambitious ruler consolidating power. He's now a strategist focused on sustainability, making sure the territories, armies, and political alliances he built would endure even after he was gone. One of his main challenges was the Crusader strongholds along the coast. Cities like Acre resisted direct assaults, fortified heavily, and often received reinforcements from Europe. Rather than risk his armies in costly frontal attacks, Saladin relied on sieges, blockades, and diplomacy. He would starve out garrisons, cut off supplies, and negotiate when advantageous. This approach minimized unnecessary bloodshed while keeping the Crusaders off balance. At the same time, Saladin continued to manage internal politics with care. His empire was vast but diverse, and loyalty could have been fragile. He appointed trusted family members and capable generals as governors, often rotating positions to prevent rivalries from destabilizing his rule. He also maintained ties with scholars, judges, and religious leaders, ensuring that his authority was respected not just militarily, but socially and spiritually. Even in these later years, Saladin faced threats from ambitious nobles, rebel factions, and opportunistic warlords. Yet he handled each situation with the same blend of prudence, force, and ethical calculation that had defined his entire career. He understood that leadership wasn't just about winning battles, it was about making a system work, even in times of chaos. Perhaps most remarkable is how he maintained his reputation for mercy and honor, even late in life. Captured enemies were treated with dignity, civilians were protected, and his courts were known for fairness. While some rulers would have become harsher with age, Saladin's character remained consistent, further cementing his legend across cultures. By the mid-11th century, Saladin had essentially secured the Muslim hold over the Levant, stabilizing territories, keeping the Crusaders contained, and leaving a network of strong, loyal governors in place. Even though the Crusades would continue after his death, the world he left behind was vastly different from the fragmented, chaotic Middle East he had inherited. What truly sets Saladin apart isn't just what he did, it's who he was. The man behind the armor was as remarkable as the victories he achieved. Let's start with generosity. Saladin was known for giving freely, not just to his family or allies, but also to the poor, scholars, and even former enemies. Stories abound of him providing food, money, and protection to those in need, even during times of war. He understood that leadership wasn't just about power. It was about responsibility and care for the people under your charge. This generosity extended to prisoners as well. After battles, he often released captives, sometimes for ransom, but sometimes simply out of mercy. This wasn't naivete. It was strategic humanity that earned him respect and loyalty far beyond his own armies. Next, his faith. Saladin's spirituality was a guiding principle, not just a public image. He prayed, fasted, and observed religious duties seriously, but he also applied those principles to governance. His decisions were often filtered through a lens of justice and morality, reflecting a deep sense of purpose. This faith wasn't rigid dogma. It was practical and ethical, shaping both his diplomacy and his treatment of enemies. Then there's his humility. Despite commanding vast armies and ruling a powerful empire, Saladin lived modestly. He avoided excessive luxury, ate simple meals, and preferred to be close to his troops. Unlike many rulers who flaunted their wealth, Saladin let his actions speak. He was respected not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through integrity and competence. But perhaps the most striking aspect of his character was his sense of justice and honor. He was deeply committed to fairness, whether in administering his own territories or negotiating with enemies. His reputation for honor transcended borders. Even Christian chroniclers of the time wrote about his fairness, courage, and wisdom, which was remarkable considering they were his adversaries. In many ways, Saladin's personal qualities were inseparable from his leadership style. They made him an effective ruler and a legendary figure. People followed him not just because he was strong, but because he embodied the kind of leadership that inspires loyalty, respect, and admiration. After decades of military campaigns, statecraft, and uniting vast territories, Saladin's story ends not with fanfare, but with quiet dignity. By 1193, Saladin's health began to fail. The Sultan, who had ridden across deserts, commanded armies, and negotiated with kings, now faced the inevitability that every human must confront: mortality. Even in his last days, though, his character shined through. He continued to concern himself with the administration of his empire, ensuring that his territories remained stable and that his successors would be capable of holding the realm together. He didn't cling to power out of pride. He focused on responsibility and legacy. Accounts from the time describe his final moments as calm and reflective. He reportedly smiled, prayed, and accepted his fate with serenity, emphasizing faith over fear. Even in death, he remained true to the values that had defined him: humility, piety, and care for those around him. His funeral was significant, yet understated. Crowds mourned not just a sultan or military leader, but a man whose reputation for justice, mercy, and integrity had transcended politics and war. Leaders from across the region remembered him not merely for the territories he controlled or the battles he won, but for the example he set as a ruler and human being. Saladin's death marked the end of an era, but it also cemented his legacy. Unlike many conquerors whose deaths sparked immediate chaos or power struggles, Saladin's life had been a carefully constructed balance of ethics, strategy, and leadership. His empire would eventually fragment, as most dynasties do, but the memory of the man himself, his character, his victories, his mercy, would live on. In the end, Saladin didn't leave behind just lands or titles. He left behind a model of leadership, a blueprint for how strength and virtue can coexist. His story reminds us that greatness isn't measured only by conquest, but by the combination of wisdom, justice, and humanity. Saladin's life may have ended in 1193, but his story didn't. It's one of the rare historical tales that resonates across cultures, religions, and centuries. But what makes a 12th century sultan from the Middle East still feel relevant today? First, there's the legendary military genius. Victories like Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem weren't just about brute force. They were about strategy, patience, and foresight. Military historians still study his campaigns because they show how intellect, timing, and resourcefulness can triumph over raw power. In an age obsessed with instant results, Saladin's careful planning and calculated risks remind us that success often comes from patience and understanding the bigger picture. Then there's the ethical dimension. Saladin is celebrated not just for what he achieved, but how he achieved it. Mercy to prisoners, fair treatment of civilians, respect for religious sites, and integrity in diplomacy. These are qualities that stand out in a historical period often defined by cruelty and conquest. His story suggests that true leadership doesn't require cruelty. It can coexist with justice and honor. That's why he's admired not just in Muslim history, but by scholars, writers, and even Western chroniclers of the Crusades. Saladin's life also highlights the power of unifying vision. He inherited a fragmented world, divided by rivalries, fear, and mistrust, and managed to bring together people under a common cause. It wasn't just political, it was symbolic. This reminds us that leadership is as much about inspiring people and building trust as it is about winning battles. And let's not forget the human aspect. Saladin was a scholar, a devout man, a generous ruler, and a pragmatic strategist. His story shows that greatness is multidimensional. It's not just power or conquest, but character, wisdom, and resilience. People remember him because he embodied a rare combination of courage, intellect, and morality. Saladin's story shows us that even in times of chaos, it's possible to lead with strength, wisdom, and compassion. He wasn't just a warrior or a king. He was a model of principled leadership that resonates across time. And that maybe is the reason he's still remembered today.